The church smelled like polished wood and roses, and every seat was filled. 500 guests had been carefully split down the aisle on the left, polished suits and designer gowns, the business world that worshipped my sister, Victoria. On the right, uniforms, medals, straight-backed men and women I had served with for years. It wasn't subtle. Victoria had staged the guest list to make a point, her world versus mine. She thought she was going to win. I stood at the back of the aisle in my dress whites. My uniform was sharp, pressed, every ribbon aligned, shoes reflecting the stained glass light. I knew walking out like this would cause whispers. I knew Victoria hated it. That's why I wore it. Because I earned it. Every scar, every sleepless night, every deployment was stitched into that fabric. I wasn't about to hide who I was. Not for her, not for anyone. The organ started the processional, steady notes echoing off the stone walls. My heels hit the floor in time with the music, and the chapel went silent. Not even the rustle of a program. Just 500 people holding their breath as I walked down the aisle in uniform instead of a white dress. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Victoria in the front row, her expression carved into something between disgust and outrage. She had dressed herself like a queen floor-length black gown, diamonds big enough to blind a cameraman, hair sculpted like she was preparing for a magazine cover. Of course, she had called photographers. To her, this wedding wasn't about me. It was about her image. She wanted headlines. She wanted control. And she wasn't getting either. Halfway down the aisle, the murmurs began. People in her crowd whispered into their champagne glasses. A few of the military guests smirked, nodding to me with quiet respect. I kept my eyes forward, my chin high, every inch of my posture screaming discipline. I wasn't nervous. I'd faced down enemy fire. I'd carried men twice my size off the field. This was just another battle, and my opponent was wearing diamonds instead of camo. When I reached the front, Jason was waiting. He wore a simple navy suit, nothing flashy, no attempt to outshine anyone. His calm eyes locked on me, and for a moment the tension faded. But only for a moment. Because Victoria rose from her seat. She didn't just stand, she staged it. Slow, deliberate, making sure every single person turned to look. She stepped into the aisle like she owned it. The organ faltered, the music stopping mid-note. The guests hushed instantly, sensing blood in the water. Victoria loved an audience, and she had one. Her heels clicked against the stone as she moved closer, her voice slicing through the silence. "Take off those medals," she said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "This is a wedding, not a parade. You're embarrassing this family." The words hit harder than the organ ever could. I could feel 500 eyes burning into me, some shocked, some expectant, some eager for a fight. Victoria smiled like she'd already won. She wanted me to crack, to fold, to play the part of the little sister who never measured up. She'd humiliated me at dinners, at parties, at family gatherings. But this wasn't her mansion or her boardroom. This was my wedding. I met her glare head on. "No," I said. "Nothing fancy, nothing long, just no." My voice was steady, sharp enough to cut. The sound carried through the church like a verdict. A gasp rolled through the crowd. You'd think I'd just declared war, and maybe I had. Victoria's face tightened, her smile curdling into rage. She wasn't used to being denied, especially not in public, and especially not by me. She stepped closer, her words dripping with venom. "Do you even understand what you're doing? Look around you. These people are here for me. They respect me. You're just some uniform with shiny trinkets pinned to your chest. You're a disgrace." I didn't move. My hands stayed at my sides, my shoulders square. The medals on my chest clinked lightly with the rise of my breath, a reminder of everything she would never understand. I wasn't going to take them off. Not for her, not for anyone. And that's when she snapped. In one motion, faster than most guests could process, Victoria raised her hand. The slap cracked across the room like a gunshot. My head jerked to the side, cheek stinging, but my body didn't budge. The sound echoed off the walls. For a second, no one breathed. Forks froze midair at the back of the room. Glasses trembled in hands. It wasn't just a slap. It was the CEO of Mitchell Realty, the darling of Boston society, striking her sister in front of 500 witnesses. My face burned, But I didn't flinch. I stood taller. Because I wasn't just her little sister. I wasn't just some family embarrassment. I was a decorated officer in the United States Navy, and she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Before I could respond, another hand caught hers mid-swing, locking around her wrist with iron control. Jason stepped between us, calm but unyielding. He didn't shove her, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the air in the room. He leaned closer to her, his voice low, but sharp enough for everyone in the front rows to hear. And whatever power Victoria thought she held vanished. I grew up in a mansion outside Boston that looked perfect from the street. High stone walls, iron gates, manicured lawns, it had all the trappings of success. Inside, it was colder than marble. My father, Gregory Mitchell, built Mitchell Realty Group from scratch, and he made sure nobody forgot it. To him, everything was a transaction. Affection wasn't part of the budget. He didn't raise children. He groomed heirs. Victoria, my older sister, was the golden child. From the time she could talk, he was prepping her for the boardroom. At the dinner table, she gave little presentations about deals she pretended to make with other kids at school. He ate it up. "That's my girl," he'd beam, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. Meanwhile, I'd talk about a history project on the Revolutionary War, and he'd shut me down with a wave of his hand. "Soldiers take orders, Mitchells give them." That line became his favorite way to remind me I was wasting his time. The house itself felt like a museum. Oil paintings, leather chairs, endless silence, broken only by the sound of my father's shoes clicking across the floor when he came home from the office. 6:30 sharp, dinner on the table, no excuses. We weren't a family, we were a schedule. You learned quickly that if you wanted attention, you had to perform. Victoria knew the script. I never did. It didn't help that my two brothers fell neatly into the mold. Saturday mornings, Dad took them golfing at the club. They came back with stories about stocks and market trends. He listened to them like they were already executives. When it came to me, he focused on appearances. "You'll be judged by who you marry, not what you do," he told me more than once. Translation: keep quiet, smile at the right moments, and marry into another fortune. That was his vision for my life. Nothing more. The only softness in that house came from my mother, Helen. She loved books, music, and quiet evenings that Dad dismissed as wasted time. She read poetry to me at night, snuck me novels about explorers and pioneers, and whispered, "Don't let anyone decide your worth, not even your father." She couldn't stop him from dominating the house, but she gave me something he never could: belief that I mattered outside his empire. Still, it was impossible to ignore the pecking order. At family dinners, my brothers bragged about business competitions at school, and Victoria recited the details of Dad's latest real estate deal like she'd negotiated it herself. Dad leaned back, satisfied, cigar smoke curling around his head, proud of the empire he thought he was building. When I opened my mouth to talk about the Navy, the room froze like I'd farted at the table. "Nobody respects uniforms," he said once. "They respect titles." Victoria smirked across the table, loving every second of my humiliation. That was her specialty, making sure I remembered my place. I learned early to keep my interests quiet. At night, I hid under the covers with a flashlight, reading books about military strategy, World War II battles, and biographies of commanders. I wanted to understand what real leadership looked like, the kind that wasn't about controlling boardrooms but about carrying responsibility when it mattered most. It was the exact opposite of what my father worshipped, which only made me want it more. When I was 12, I asked if I could join the junior ROTC program at school. I thought maybe he'd be impressed that I wanted structure and discipline. I handed him the flyer at dinner, proud of myself. He didn't even glance at it. He just stabbed his steak and said, "Ridiculous. Marching around in cheap uniforms won't put food on the table." I tried to argue. It's about leadership, about service. He slammed his knife down, the sound cutting through the room. "Mitchells are saluted, we don't salute others." The silence that followed was suffocating. My brothers smirked, relieved it wasn't them in the crosshairs. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand. That was all the comfort I got. Moments like that piled up. By high school, the gap between me and the rest of the family felt like a canyon. Victoria strutted through the house in designer clothes, already planning her MBA. My brother's obsessed over internships and hedge funds. And me? I lingered at the edge of the football field, watching ROTC kids drill in unison, boots hitting pavement in sharp rhythm. They looked like they belonged to something real. I wanted that. The mansion was full of power, but it was empty of respect. If you failed to fit the blueprint, you were invisible, and I was invisible most of the time. Unless, of course, I embarrassed them by talking about the military. Then I became the family joke. Victoria loved to twist the knife. So, what branch are you thinking? She'd sneer. Navy? Army? Maybe you can be the one polishing boots while the real players make money. She said it with a smile that matched Dad's approval. To them, I was entertainment. The worst part was how much Dad believed his own myth. He strutted around the house like a general returning from campaign, keys hitting the marble table, tie knotted with military precision, shoes polished until you could see yourself in them. He thought he was the model of discipline, but his discipline only applied to others. For himself, there were cigars, bourbon, and control. Always control. If you followed his script, you were rewarded. If you didn't, you were ignored or worse. And yet, even in that suffocating house, the thought never left me. I was going to find a way out. Not just out of the mansion, but out of his grip. One night, after another round of insults at the dinner table, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I remembered his words. Soldiers take orders, Mitchells give them. He thought it was a slam dunk, the kind of line that ended an argument, but to me, it sounded like a challenge. I whispered to myself, we'll see about that. I didn't stop thinking about the ROTC kids drilling on the football field. Their boots hit the ground in perfect rhythm, and I could feel something in my chest tighten every time I watched them. They had a purpose. They had discipline. They had each other. At home, I had Victoria calling me useless and a father who treated me like a failed stock investment. So I started sneaking into the school library, pulling every book I could find about the Navy. I read about naval battles in the Pacific, supply chains that kept entire fleets alive, and commanders who had to make life-or-death calls in seconds. That was the kind of life I wanted. Not real estate contracts and golf swings. Mom noticed first. She found me at the kitchen table one night, scribbling notes from a dog-eared library book about the Battle of Midway. She didn't scold me. She just poured herself tea and said, "Your father will never understand this, but I do." She started sliding me brochures for service academies, slipping them between my textbooks, always quiet, always careful. She was the only one who believed me when I said I wanted to wear the uniform. She knew it wasn't a phase, it was a decision. I signed up for junior ROTC without telling anyone. I figured if Dad found out, he'd shut it down before I even got started. The first morning I showed up in that uniform, it wasn't much cheap fabric. Stiff collar, shoes that pinched but it felt like armor. For once, I wasn't invisible. The instructors didn't care about my last name or how much money my family had. They cared if I showed up on time, if I marched in step, if I followed through. I did, and I loved every second of it. Of course, secrecy never lasts in a house like mine. One evening, Dad came home earlier than usual. I had laid my uniform out on the bed, ironing it with more care than I'd ever given anything else. He walked in without knocking, saw the pressed shirt, and laughed. Not a warm laugh, a sharp, cutting one. "Don't waste your time on that nonsense," he said. "Soldiers take orders. CEOs give them." Same line, different night. I tried to hold my ground. It teaches discipline. Leadership. He shook his head, still smiling that cruel smile. It teaches you to be beneath people. And you're not beneath anyone, except you keep acting like you are. The argument went nowhere. He stormed out, muttering about how I was embarrassing him. Victoria caught the whole thing from the hallway. She leaned against the wall, smirking, and said, "You'll grow out of it, or you'll wash out. Either way, Dad's right. You don't belong there." I wanted to snap back, but I didn't. I just went back to ironing, pressing out the wrinkles like I could press out the doubt. The truth was, I did belong there. Every drill, every inspection, every push-up pushed me closer to who I wanted to be. I stopped caring about being the invisible Mitchell. In JROTC, nobody cared about my last name. They cared that I could lead a squad without losing cadence. They cared that I showed up when it was pouring rain and when it was freezing cold. I was finally being measured by effort, not pedigree. Mom kept backing me quietly. When brochures for the Naval Academy started arriving in the mail, she tucked them under my pillow. She knew Dad would throw them away if he found them. One evening, she sat beside me and said, "He will never approve, but you don't need his approval." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. Approval was never coming. Respect, maybe, but only if I carved it out myself. By my junior year of high school, I was spending more time with the ROTC program than with my family. Drill practice, competitions, weekend training, I was there for all of it. And every time I put on that uniform, I felt like I was pulling farther away from the marble halls and crystal chandeliers of the mansion. The more Dad pushed, the more determined I became. He wanted me at Harvard Business School. I wanted Annapolis. He wanted me to marry into another empire. I wanted to earn my own rank. We were on a collision course, and I knew it. One night sealed it. We were at another stiff family dinner, the kind where conversation was less about family and more about performance reviews. My brothers talked about internships and hedge funds. Victoria bragged about a networking event at the country club. Dad nodded, pleased, sipping his bourbon like a king holding court. I finally spoke up. "I'm applying to the Naval Academy." The fork clattered out of Victoria's hand. My brothers laughed under their breath. Dad didn't even look up from his glass. "You're throwing away every advantage you've been given," I pushed back. "It's my choice." That's when he looked up, eyes cold as stone. "If you walk down that path, don't expect me beside you." The table went silent. Victoria smirked like she'd just won a prize. My brothers avoided my eyes. Mom squeezed my hand under the table, the only sign of support. I didn't say another word, but inside I knew. That was the moment the decision locked in. I wasn't backing down. Not for him, not for anyone. After dinner, I stood at the window in my room, staring at the flag whipping in the evening wind. I thought about every time he told me soldiers were beneath CEOs. Every time Victoria called me a joke. Every time I felt invisible, I whispered to myself, one day, I'll salute it on my terms. The summer after high school, I sat in my room with the acceptance letter from Annapolis in my hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of every argument I'd had with my father was pressed into the ink. I'd worked for it every late-night study session, every mile run before sunrise, every drill in the rain. It wasn't a gift. It was earned. But when I showed it to my family, the celebration I hoped for never came. I walked into the living room with the envelope. Mom was sitting on the couch, reading. Dad was in his leather chair with the Wall Street Journal open, glass of bourbon sweating on the table beside him. Victoria was perched on the armrest, scrolling through her phone like she was waiting to be photographed. I cleared my throat, held up the letter, and said, "I got in. The Naval Academy." Mom's face lit up instantly, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, Lauren, that's incredible." She stood and hugged me, tight, like she knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Dad didn't move. He didn't even look up from his paper. "So, you're serious about this nonsense," he muttered. He turned the page. That was it. No congratulations, no smile, just dismissal. Victoria smirked over her phone. "Well, I hope you like crawling through mud. That's your future now." The message was clear. I wasn't going to get support. I wasn't going to get money. Dad cut off every financial safety net the moment I said Annapolis out loud. "If you're going to play soldier," he told me, "you'll do it without my help." He meant it. He closed accounts, canceled cards, and made it clear. Once I left, I was on my own. Mom slipped me cash when she could, small amounts tucked into envelopes with notes that said, "We believe in you." But she couldn't undo the wall Dad built. Leaving the mansion that August was the cleanest break of my life. I packed my duffel bag, hugged my mom until she whispered, "Be strong," and walked out the front door without looking back. My father didn't even come downstairs. Victoria didn't bother saying goodbye. As I climbed into the cab that would take me to the airport, I felt lighter, not because it was easy, but because it was finally mine, my path, my choice. Annapolis didn't care who I was. The academy had a way of stripping everyone down to the same level. Day one, they shaved heads, shouted orders, and made sure you understood you weren't special. I remember standing in formation, sweat dripping down my back, as an upperclassman screamed in my face, Do you think your daddy's money can help you here? Think again. I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. Because he was right, none of that mattered here. The mansion, the cars, the country club connections, they were useless. The only thing that mattered was endurance. Could you take it? Could you last? I could. The days blurred into a grind. Up before dawn, running until my lungs burned, push-ups until my arms gave out, inspections so strict a single wrinkle in your uniform could cost you hours of extra drills. A lot of people broke. Some quit. I didn't. Every insult, every order, every punishing drill was fuel. Every time I wanted to quit, I saw Victoria's smirk in my head, heard my father's voice saying, "Soldiers take orders." I kept going out of spite as much as out of pride. By the end of the first year, I started to find my rhythm. I learned to shine my shoes until they looked like glass, to eat in under 5 minutes, to operate on 4 hours of sleep. I learned that leadership wasn't about barking the loudest orders, but about knowing when to shut up and when to step forward. Slowly, people started looking to me during drills, waiting for my signal. Respect came, not because of my last name, but because I showed up every damn day. I still tried to share it with my family. At the end of plebe summer, I mailed a photo of myself in uniform, standing in formation with my classmates. Weeks later, I got an envelope back. Inside wasn't a note of congratulations. It was a clipped article from a business magazine about Victoria closing some deal at Mitchell Realty. On the yellow sticky note, in my father's handwriting, "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half and threw it away. After that, I stopped mailing photos. Life at Annapolis didn't get easier, but I got stronger. By sophomore year, I was tutoring classmates in logistics and strategy. By junior year, I was running morning drills. By senior year, I was leading full training exercises. The academy pushed me to the edge, but I never went over. And every time I thought I couldn't take another step, I pictured my father's disappointment, Victoria's laughter. That was enough to keep me moving. Graduation came fast. I stood in my dress whites, cap tucked under my arm, as the band played and the crowd cheered. Families waved flags, snapped photos, cried tears of pride. I scanned the stands even though I knew better. Mom was there, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, beaming at me like I'd just won the world. Dad wasn't. Neither were my siblings. They had board meetings and charity galas, no time for a daughter or sister proving them wrong. I stood at attention as my commission was read, my new rank pinned to my shoulder. The weight of it was heavier than any necklace Victoria ever flaunted, and far more valuable. That night, I called home. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I hung up, tossed it on the bed, and sat in silence. I realized then I didn't need them. Not anymore. Their approval wasn't coming, and I didn't need it. I'd already earned something they could never buy. Respect. Commissioning was only the starting line. Once I left Annapolis with those shiny new bars on my shoulder, reality set in. The Navy didn't care about diplomas or family names, it cared about whether you could hack it in the field. My first posting dropped me in Norfolk, Virginia, where training hit harder than anything I'd faced at the academy. At Annapolis, you were tested to see if you could break. Out here, you were tested to see if you could survive. The days started before dawn. PT in the dark, running along the piers with the cold air cutting into your lungs, then straight into drills. Logistics sounded like paperwork on the outside, but in the military it meant making sure people lived. If a supply line failed, if food didn't arrive, if fuel wasn't there when it needed to be, people died. That pressure never let up. The instructors drove that lesson home with a cruelty that wasn't personal but wasn't gentle either. "You don't get to screw up," one barked in my face while I tried to balance numbers under time limits. "Because your screw up means someone doesn't come home." There were times I thought about quitting. The physical grind was relentless sandbags, obstacle courses, ruck marches that made every joint scream. But the mental toll was worse. Hours of wargaming, memorizing details, running scenarios until my eyes blurred. You weren't allowed to just be good. You had to be exact. A single mistake could ripple out to disaster. That voice in the back of my head, the one that sounded like my father kept trying to tell me I wasn't cut out for this. Every time, I shut it down with another lap, another rep, another long night bent over maps and charts. The toughest part was how public the failures were. At Annapolis, if you messed up, it was your grade. Here, if you missed a detail, the entire unit paid for it. One mistake, and 50 people might find themselves in the mud because of you. And they wouldn't let you forget it. I learned fast to double-check everything, to speak only when I was sure, and to own it when I wasn't. That earned me some respect. But it also meant I carried weight nobody else wanted. Responsibility came at a cost. One day during a training exercise, the instructors staged a supply drop gone wrong. We had 30 minutes to reroute resources before the simulated unit ran dry. Everyone panicked, shouting over each other, scrambling. I locked in, scribbling numbers, barking out orders to move trucks, redirect fuel. We made it with 3 minutes to spare. My CO pulled me aside afterward. "Not bad," he said. "Now do it under fire." That was the Navy way. Never let you think you'd arrived. Always push the line further. It wasn't all drills. We rotated through survival training, weapons handling, damage control. Nothing glamorous, but all necessary. I'll never forget the first time I was shoved into a flooding compartment. Water rising fast, alarms blaring, told to patch a rupture before the whole space filled. Panic clawed at my throat, but my hands worked. Clamp, brace, seal. When the water finally slowed, I was shaking so hard I could barely climb out. The instructor didn't pat me on the back. He just said, "If that had been real, you'd still be alive." That was praise enough. The physical punishment left scars I carried for weeks. Strained muscles, bruises, blisters that turned into calluses. But it was the mental toughness that changed me. You stop asking, "Can I do this?" and start saying, "I don't have a choice." You keep moving because stopping isn't on the menu. It was brutal, but it hardened me in ways I didn't know I needed. Every day built a layer of armor no one could take away. Of course, there were reminders that I didn't come from the same world as most of the others. Jokes about the mansion, about my last name. "Hey, princess, you sure your butler packed your ruck, right?" They thought it was funny. Sometimes I laughed it off, sometimes I didn't. Once, when one guy pushed too far, I snapped back. "At least I know how to earn my place." He didn't joke with me again. That was the thing about the military, you didn't win respect with clever comebacks. You won it by proving you could bleed and sweat with everyone else. By the time the first year was over, I wasn't the same person who walked out of that mansion with a duffel bag. My hands were rougher, my body leaner, my patience thinner but stronger where it counted. The softness my father mocked was gone, replaced by grit he would never understand. Promotions came slower than praise, but eventually my CO pinned a new bar to my shoulder. It wasn't flashy, just a quiet ceremony in front of my unit. But it meant something. It meant I had carried the weight without dropping it. That night, I called home again. I don't know why I still tried. The line rang until the machine picked up. I left a message, "I was promoted today." No one called back. Days later, a letter arrived. I opened it, expecting maybe a note from Mom. Instead, it was another clipping from a magazine about Victoria, this time with her face on the cover under the headline, "The Next Real Estate Powerhouse." My father's scrawl at the bottom, "Your sister makes me proud every day." I crumpled it and tossed it in the trash. Then I went for a run until my legs burned and my chest felt like it would explode. That was how I handled it, turning their silence into fuel. Pain, exhaustion, silence. It all blended into something sharp, something that cut away doubt. I learned to trust myself when no one else would. I learned that medals weren't decorations, they were receipts, proof you'd paid the cost. And I decided I would keep paying it. Because unlike boardrooms and cocktail parties, this was real. Deployment wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what recruiters sell you in slick videos with dramatic music and perfect salutes. My first assignment sent me to Okinawa, then straight into Iraq. The transition was jarring. One week I was standing on a pier in Virginia, uniform pressed and shoes polished. The next, I was sweating in a desert where the air itself felt like punishment, the kind of heat that bakes you from the inside out. Nobody cared about your backstory out there. They cared about whether you got the job done and whether you kept them alive. Okinawa was the warm-up. Long hours coordinating supply lines, making sure every box of ammo, every ration pack, every gallon of fuel got where it needed to be. It was the kind of work that bored most people. But I knew better. A missed shipment meant a stalled operation. A stalled operation meant people vulnerable in the field. Precision mattered, and I built a reputation fast as someone who didn't let details slip. Guys who'd rolled their eyes at me during training stopped joking when they realized nothing went missing on my watch. Then came Iraq. The first convoy I managed rolled out at dawn under a sun that felt more like a weapon than weather. We'd plotted the route a dozen times, double-checked every vehicle, rehearsed contingencies. But real life doesn't follow rehearsals. Halfway through, we hit trouble. Small arms fire kicked up from a side street, rounds pinging off metal. Chaos erupted, drivers slamming brakes, guys yelling, the radio a mess of voices. My training snapped into place. I grabbed the comms, cut through the noise, and barked orders. Keep moving, stagger the formation, medic to the third truck. My voice didn't shake, even if my hands did. One of the trucks took a hit and veered off, axle blown. Without thinking, I jumped from my Humvee and sprinted toward it. Bullets cracked overhead, dirt spitting around my boots. The driver was slumped, bleeding. I grabbed his vest, hauled him out, and dragged him back to cover with another Marine laying down fire. My arms screamed, but I didn't stop until we were behind the line. The medic went to work, and I went back to the radio. Keep pushing, don't stop. We got the convoy through. We all made it out alive. Afterward, I sat on the tailgate of a Humvee, shirt soaked, arms trembling from adrenaline. A Navy SEAL walked over, a guy twice my size with a scar running down his jaw. He dropped down beside me, handed me his canteen, and said one word, "Ma'am." Not sarcastic, not mocking, just flat, respectful. I knew then I'd crossed some invisible line. Respect in the field wasn't handed out. You earned it one bloody, messy moment at a time. Those deployments blurred into a rhythm: dust, sweat, exhaustion, and decisions made on the fly. Some days it was routine convoys that went smooth, just endless roads and scorching heat. Other days, it was chaos, broken vehicles, wrong intel, ambushes. You learned to live in a state of constant readiness. Sleep became optional. Food was whatever you could shovel down between radio calls. And through it all, the only thing that mattered was whether you could be trusted when it counted. I stopped trying to call home after a while. Time zones made it hard and silence made it harder. When I did manage to connect, my father's voice was cold as ever. "So, still playing soldier?" he'd say. I'd answer, "It's not playing." He'd scoff, change the subject to Victoria's latest business venture, then hang up. Mom tried, but even her voice grew faint over bad connections. The truth was, my real family was the people standing next to me in the desert, the ones who didn't care what my last name was. They cared whether I'd keep them breathing. I collected ribbons quietly, each one representing something survived rather than celebrated. I didn't pin them on for vanity. They were proof of nights without sleep, decisions made under fire, lives saved because I refused to freeze. They weighed heavier on me than any jewelry Victoria ever flaunted at her galas, but I carried them proudly. One night after a long mission, I sat with a small group of Marines under a torn canvas, rain dripping through holes, the ground turning to mud under our boots. One of them, a kid barely 20, asked, "Why'd you even join up? You don't talk like us. Don't act like you grew up like us." I told him the truth. Because I wanted to earn something my father couldn't buy. He nodded, chewing on that for a while, then said, "Well, you earned it today." That was worth more than anything my family back home could have said. Respect grew slowly but steadily. By the time I rotated back, no one called me princess. No one doubted if I belonged. They knew. I'd stood in the same dirt, taken the same risks, carried the same weight. And when I walked into a room, even SEALsmen with more scars than I could count gave me that nod, the one that said, "You're one of us." That mattered more than any boardroom applause could. When I got back stateside, I carried the desert with me, the heat, the scars, the sound of bullets cracking in the distance. I also carried something else, proof that I wasn't the disappointment my father thought I was. I wasn't just a soldier taking orders. I was an officer who had earned respect the hard way, and I wasn't done yet. Coming home on leave after Iraq was supposed to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like walking into a different battlefield. The Mitchell mansion hadn't changed, gleaming marble floors, chandeliers, and the smell of cigars drifting from my father's study. But I had. I walked in with sunburned skin, calloused hands, and a uniform that carried dust no polish could hide. The first dinner back reminded me just how far apart we were. We sat around the long oak table under that same chandelier, I'd stared at 1,000 nights as a kid. Dad at the head, glass of bourbon in hand. Victoria across from me, dressed in some designer outfit that probably cost more than my car. My brothers were there too, already sliding into the roles Dad had carved for them, talking numbers, market trends, and mergers. I barely recognized the conversation. It was like they were speaking a language that no longer applied to my world. When Dad turned to me, it wasn't with pride or even curiosity. "So," he said, swirling the bourbon, "still playing soldier?" I kept my voice calm. "It's not playing," he smirked. "Medals don't pay mortgages," Victoria chimed in without missing a beat. "She's right, Dad. Newspapers forget ribbons. My deals live forever." The table laughed. I didn't. I just cut into my food and kept my posture straight, the same way I'd done under fire. Mom tried to steer things, asking about where I'd been, what it was like. But every time I started to answer, Dad waved me off. "We don't need the war stories at dinner." That stung more than I let show. I'd risk my life in places he couldn't find on a map, but in that room, it meant nothing. What mattered was the latest real estate deal or how Victoria had charmed some investor over cocktails. After dinner, Dad pulled me aside into his study. The walls lined with books he never read, trophies from charity golf tournaments, the whole place reeking of power and money. He poured another drink and leaned back. "You've made your point," he said. "You wanted to prove you could play tough. Fine. Now it's time to think about the family. Come back, join the company. Enough of this uniform nonsense." I stared at him. "I'm not done." His eyes narrowed. "You're wasting your life." I shook my head. "No, I'm building one." He didn't argue further. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. The gap grew wider every visit. I'd show up with new ribbons, new scars, new stories of lives saved. They'd show me magazine covers of Victoria, headlines about expansions, spreads about record profits. Dad would slide them across the table like proof of her superiority. He never once asked what my ribbons meant. He never wanted to know. To him, success was measured in square footage and dollar signs, not in blood or survival. At a family party, surrounded by business associates and socialites, Victoria took the stage to give a toast. She raised her glass, smiled that perfect smile, and said, "Some people collect medals. Some of us build empires. I know which one matters." The room laughed politely, clinking glasses. My jaw tightened, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. When she stepped down, she leaned in and whispered, "One day you'll realize no one remembers the soldier. They only remember the CEO." I looked her dead in the eye. "We'll see." Outside of that house, things were different. When I walked onto a base, men and women snapped to attention. SEALs, Marines, sailors, they knew me, respected me. They trusted me with their lives. That was the family I chose. The mansion was blood, but the Navy was loyalty. And loyalty, unlike blood, had to be earned. Mom was the only bridge left. She called when she could, asked questions Dad never bothered with, sent letters full of encouragement. "Keep choosing what's true," she'd write in her careful script. But even she couldn't close the divide. Every time she tried to smooth things over, Dad would bulldoze the conversation. "She'll come around eventually," he'd say, like I was just going through a rebellious phase. He never understood that I wasn't rebelling, I was living. The worst part was the way they dismissed the cost. They never saw the sleepless nights, the shrapnel scars, the friends buried with folded flags. To them, my service was a hobby, an embarrassing detour from the path laid out for me. To me, it was everything. Every salute, every ribbon, every nod from a SEAL who'd seen me under pressure that was worth more than all the mansions in Boston. On one visit, I walked into the mansion with a newspaper in my hand. The front page featured a photo of me receiving a commendation after a deployment. I set it on the table in front of Dad. He glanced at it once, then pushed it aside. "Victoria just closed a deal in Chicago," he said. "Now that's news." I picked up the paper and folded it neatly. "No," I said. "That's history." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence had become the language of our divide. Each trip home was shorter than the last. I'd show up, endure the jabs and dismissals, hug Mom, then leave. The longer I stayed, the more suffocating it felt. By the time I drove back to base, the relief was almost overwhelming. I belonged where respect was earned, not where it was denied. And every mile between me and that mansion felt like another mile closer to the life I wanted. The distance between us wasn't measured in miles, though. It was measured in values. Dad and Victoria believed in power, appearances, and control. I believed in honor, sacrifice, and truth. There was no middle ground. And the more I lived my life, the clearer it became. I wasn't going back. I met Jason Reed in Norfolk, though met doesn't really capture it. It was less a polite introduction and more a collision between two careers that had been circling each other. I was overseeing logistics for a joint training exercise, making sure a convoy had what it needed before moving out. He was there with his SEAL team, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. We crossed paths over a supply manifest. He pointed at a line item I'd already fixed and said, "This one's wrong." I raised an eyebrow. "Check again." He did. I was right. He smiled a little, not embarrassed, just amused. "Guess I'll keep my mouth shut next time." I didn't smile back, but I remembered the way he said it light, not defensive. The respect didn't come overnight. SEALs weren't quick to trust outsiders, especially officers who hadn't bled with them yet. But respect is earned the same way everywhere, by showing up and not screwing up. During one operation, intel shifted fast, and the whole plan threatened to unravel. I had to make a call, reroute supplies, adjust timing, gamble that my numbers would hold. Jason's team was depending on it. When they rolled back hours later, dusty, sweating but alive, he sought me out. "Your call saved us a mess," he said simply. "No speeches, no ceremony. Just the acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to stake lives on decisions." From then on, we started seeing more of each other. Not dates at first briefings, exercises, the endless churn of military schedules. He had a way of cutting through the noise without raising his voice. While other officers filled the air with jargon, Jason just listened, then spoke a few words that clarified everything. I respected that. More than that, I liked it. Our first real off-duty conversation happened at a base gym. I was finishing a run, sweat dripping, lungs burning, when he walked in. Instead of heading to the weights, he fell into step beside me on the treadmill. "So, why the Navy?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was the kind of thing only someone who knew the cost would ask. I told him the truth that I wanted to earn something no one could buy. He nodded, like he understood completely. "That's why I stayed," he said. We ran in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, like the rhythm of boots on pavement. Eventually, we started spending more time together outside the uniform. Nothing dramatic, just diner breakfasts, late-night coffee runs, walking along the pier after long days. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to impress me with war stories or swagger. He asked questions that mattered. "How do you keep people calm under fire? What goes through your head when you're making those calls?" I'd shrug and say, "It's just duty." He'd shake his head. "No, it's trust. Don't minimize it." He had a way of calling me out without making me defensive. It was disarming in a way I didn't expect. What stood out most was that he never asked me to be smaller. My father always told me to fit his mold. Victoria wanted me to step aside, let her shine. Jason wanted none of that. He saw me as I was flawed, tired, driven, and wanted to stand beside that, not reshape it. That mattered more than I let on. The proposal wasn't fireworks or speeches. It was a quiet evening on a weathered pier, gulls crying overhead, boots dangling off the edge. He held a small box like it weighed 100 pounds and said, "I can't promise calm seas, but I can promise to row with you." That was it. No theatrics, no audience. Just him, steady as ever. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I just said yes because the answer had been there long before he asked. We started planning the wedding the same way we handled everything: simple, practical, grounded. A naval chapel, modest reception, a guest list filled with people who had actually earned a place in our lives. Not the glittering parties my family was used to, but something real. When I told my father, his first reaction wasn't congratulations. It was control. "You'll wear a proper dress," he said flatly. "Not that costume. Not in front of my friends. You won't embarrass me." I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not marrying you. I'm marrying him. And I'll wear the truth." His jaw clenched, glass of bourbon in hand, but he said nothing more. Jason didn't push me about my family. He knew enough to stay quiet when I came back from strained dinners, tense phone calls, clipped letters. But when I doubted myself, when my father's voice echoed in my head, Jason cut through it with his own. You've already proven more than he ever has. He meant it, and he lived it. That's why when he slipped that ring on my finger, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like an anchor. Our friends in the service found out about the engagement in their own ways. I never sent invitations to the Seals, but word travels fast. One by one, they pulled me aside. Torres, running on his prosthetic, grinned and said, "We'll be there, non-negotiable." Hill, calm as ever, added, "No way you're walking alone." They meant it. That was loyalty. That was family. Every step with Jason was different from the steps I'd taken in that mansion growing up. With him, I wasn't an accessory or a disappointment. I was exactly who I was supposed to be. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, standing tall in my uniform wasn't just defiance. It was the life I had built and the life we were about to share. The call came in the middle of a regular workday. I was reviewing schedules when my CO stepped into the office, face set in that way officers have when the news isn't good. "It's your mother," he said quietly. My chest went hollow. She'd been sick for a while, but hearing the words, "late stage," felt like a blow I wasn't ready for. They pushed through the leave paperwork fast, and within 48 hours I was on a flight home. Walking back into the Mitchell mansion felt like stepping into a museum where nothing had changed but everything had aged. The lemon polish smell was the same, the marble just as cold, the silence just as heavy. Mom looked smaller than I remembered, tucked into a hospital bed in the room that used to be her studio. Her hair was gone, her hands cool and papery when I held them. She smiled anyway. "You look strong," she whispered. "Are you strong?" I nodded. "I have to be." End of faddle. Dad stood in the corner like a piece of furniture, polished shoes, perfect tie, eyes empty. He didn't say much. He didn't even look at me for long. For him, grief was just another meeting to endure. For me, it was a weight pressing into my ribs. Victoria came by once, in a whirlwind of perfume and whispered calls to investors. She hugged Mom, posed for a quick photo at her bedside, then left for some gala. That was her way of showing love. My brothers hovered too, always with one eye on their phones. None of them seemed to realize we were losing the only person in that house who had ever softened its edges. When Mom was awake, she was calm, almost serene. She asked about my deployments, my plans with Jason, whether I was still following my own path. "Keep choosing what's true, even when it's not applauded," she told me one night. Her voice was thin, but steady. "Don't let them shrink you." I promised her I wouldn't. The nights were the hardest. Machines beeped softly, a reminder that time was running out. I'd sit by her bed, remembering the quiet moments she gave me growing up, poetry before bed, whispered encouragements under Dad's lectures, small hand squeezes when I thought I couldn't take it. She'd always been the quiet counterweight to his domination, and now that weight was slipping away. When she passed, it was as gentle as her life had been. A final breath, a soft smile, and then stillness. I held her hand until it cooled. Dad didn't cry. He didn't even sigh. He just adjusted his tie, nodded to the doctor, and left the room. Victoria showed up for the funeral in a dress that probably made the society pages. She gave a eulogy full of buzzwords, strength, elegance, legacy, but it rang hollow. I gave mine in uniform. I didn't dress for the guests. I dressed for Mom. She would have wanted that. Standing at the graveside, the folded flag heavy in my hands, I felt the divide between me and the rest of them become permanent. Mom had been the bridge, and now that bridge was gone. Gregory Mitchell shook hands with business partners like it was just another networking event. Victoria smiled for the cameras. My brothers made jokes to lighten the mood. I stood silent, straight-backed, the only one carrying grief like it mattered. Jason was there, not in uniform, but steady beside me. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His hand on my back kept me upright when my knees wanted to buckle. Later that night, after everyone else had disappeared back into their bubbles, he found me in the backyard, staring at the empty windows of Mom's studio. "She believed in you," he said quietly. I nodded, throat tight. She was the only one who did. He shook his head. Not the only one. After the funeral, the house felt colder than ever. Dad buried himself deeper in the company, barking orders to assistants, making calls at all hours. Victoria used the tragedy to host a charity event in Mom's name, complete with photographers and champagne. She called it honoring Mom's memory. I called it branding. We fought about it in the kitchen, voices sharp enough to cut glass. She would have hated this circus, I snapped. Victoria's lips curled. She would have wanted her name remembered. I shot back. She already is. Not because of your parties, but because of the way she lived. Victoria rolled her eyes and walked away. Leaving the mansion after that was harder than any deployment. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I knew I never really belonged there again. Without Mom, there was nothing soft left. Just marble, money, and expectations I refused to carry. Jason drove me back to base. We rode in silence most of the way, but before we got out, he reached over and took my hand. "You don't need their approval," he said. "You never did." I squeezed his hand back, holding on to that truth. Mom's death hardened something in me. I'd always fought to prove myself, to earn respect in a world that dismissed me. Now I fought to honor her words, to keep choosing what was true. She was gone, but her voice stayed with me, steady as ever, reminding me not to shrink. And if my family couldn't see it, that was their loss. I wasn't going to bend for them anymore. Time didn't slow down after Mom's funeral. If anything, it sped up. The Navy had a way of keeping you too busy to wallow. Orders came fast, new assignments, new responsibilities, and a new rank that carried weight I felt every day. I pinned on 05 Commander, after years of grinding it out in deserts, seas, and cramped bases where respect was measured by results, not family names. The ceremony itself wasn't glamorous. No parade, no spotlight. Just my CO, a handful of peers, and the words that changed everything. "You are now promoted to the rank of Commander." When the insignia pressed into my shoulder, I stood straighter. The pride didn't come from the promotion itself, but from knowing I'd earned it. Every scar, every sleepless night, every moment I'd carried responsibility that could have broken me, it all led to that moment. News spread, not because I shouted it, but because others did. A few weeks later, a journalist asked to profile me. Commander Mitchell, the headline read, "Leading with grit and discipline." The article talked about deployments, commendations, even quoted SEALs who called me steady under fire. I didn't ask for the attention, but I couldn't deny it felt good to see the work recognized. Of course, the article ended up in my family's hands. At the next gathering, Dad barely mentioned it. He shoved the paper aside like it was filler between real news. "Medals don't pay mortgages," he muttered again, as if rehearsing the same tired line. Victoria was sharper. She smirked across the table. "Cute article, but let's be real. In a year, people will forget it. My name's on buildings. That's forever." I didn't bite. I just sipped my water and let her believe her reflection in the glass mattered more than the truth I carried. The divide between us was now more public. Colleagues, neighbors, even strangers treated me differently. I'd walk through airports in uniform, and people would stop to say thank you. A child once saluted me awkwardly, his father standing proud behind him. Those moments reminded me that what I was doing mattered in ways my family's empire never could. Respect wasn't bought. It was given freely by people who understood sacrifice. Back at work, the responsibilities piled up. I wasn't just running supply lines anymore, I was shaping policy, overseeing missions, making decisions that affected hundreds at a time. The pressure was heavier, but so was the pride. Younger officers started looking to me for guidance, not because I was perfect, but because I'd survived enough to know what not to do. I made time for them, even when schedules were brutal. I remembered what it felt like to stand on the edge of quitting, wondering if you belonged. I wanted them to know they did. Jason stood with me through it all. He never cared about headlines or rank, though he teased me once, saying, "Guess I'm marrying up." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. What mattered was that he saw me the same way he always had, as someone worth standing beside. When I got home late, still smelling of diesel and dust, he didn't ask me to soften. He asked me about the mission, about the people, about what I carried on my shoulders. And when I didn't want to talk, he just sat with me. Silence with him felt like relief, not judgment. The recognition didn't just come from outside. It came from within the ranks. SEALs I'd worked with started calling me by name, not just rank. Marines gave nods of respect in hallways. Sailors saluted with a sharpness that carried pride. Those were the moments that mattered more than any article or ribbon. They were proof that I'd built something real, something my family couldn't dismiss no matter how hard they tried. But they still tried. At one family dinner, Dad laid a glossy magazine on the table featuring Victoria on the cover. "This is what legacy looks like," he said, as if to erase everything else. I stared at the photo, then at him. "Legacy isn't built on square footage," I said evenly. "It's built on what people remember when you're gone." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Maybe because deep down he knew I was right. Even my brothers, usually silent shadows at the table, started shifting uncomfortably when the digs at me came. One of them, after dinner, caught me in the hall. "For what it's worth," he said, eyes on the floor, "what you do matters more than this." He gestured vaguely toward the dining room, where Dad and Victoria were still laughing over their empire. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that not everyone in that house was blind. Recognition grew, but it never softened me. I didn't let the headlines or promotions dull the edge I'd fought so hard to sharpen. I knew better than to think respect was permanent. You had to earn it every day, every mission, every decision. That was the lesson the Navy had drilled into me, and it was one I carried with pride. When Jason and I started finalizing wedding plans, the clash with my family became inevitable. I wanted the ceremony simple, honest, grounded in truth. My father wanted optics, spectacle, another excuse to parade his influence. Victoria saw it as a stage to flaunt herself. They didn't get it. They never would. This wasn't about them. It was about us, about the life Jason and I had built, and the people who had earned the right to stand with us. The more they pushed, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a showdown. A collision between two worlds that had never truly met on equal ground. And for the first time, I wasn't bracing for their judgment. I was ready for it. The chapel in Boston was chosen months earlier. Not because it was grand, but because it was simple, honest, and carried the weight of history in its worn pews and stained glass. Jason and I agreed no circus, no theatrics, just vows, uniforms, and the people who mattered. But Victoria had other plans. She took control of the guest list under the guise of helping, and before I knew it, 500 names filled the roster. Half were CEOs, bankers, and investors from her world. The other half were military, people who had bled, trained, and stood beside me. Two worlds crammed under one roof, separated by an aisle wider than it looked. The morning of the wedding was crisp, the air sharp enough to wake you without coffee. I ironed my dress whites myself, each crease deliberate, every ribbon aligned. Jason put on his suit without fuss, calm as always. Before we left, I slipped my mother's note, "Keep choosing what's true," into my pocket. It was the only blessing I needed. Inside the chapel, the tension was palpable. On the left, my family's side, rows of tailored suits, sparkling gowns, whispers about mergers and market predictions. On the right, rows of uniforms, SEALs, Marines, sailors, men and women who'd seen things those suits couldn't imagine. Their silence wasn't judgmental. It was steady, respectful, watchful. When the music started, I walked down the aisle, each step a declaration. My medals caught the light from the stained glass, gleaming brighter than the jewelry dripping off half the guests on Victoria's side. Jason stood at the altar, steady as ever, his eyes fixed on me. Not the medals, not the spectacle, just me. That steadied me more than anything else. Then came the interruption. Halfway down the aisle, my father rose from the front row, slow and deliberate, making sure all 500 guests turned to watch. His tuxedo was sharp, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path. The organ faltered, the notes cutting off mid-bar. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He looked me up and down, eyes narrowing at the medals on my chest. "Take off those silly medals," he commanded, his voice booming enough to carry across the chapel. The words dropped like stones in water, rippling through the room. You could feel the shift, the military side bristling, the business side waiting to see if I'd obey. I stopped, straightened my spine, and met his eyes. No, just one word, steady, flat, unshaken. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire I'd ever heard. My father's face twisted with disdain, and then his hand came up fast. The slap cracked through the chapel, echoing off stained glass. My head snapped to the side, cheek burning, but my stance never faltered. Gasps erupted. Someone dropped a glass in the back, but no one moved. For a moment, everything froze: the sound, the air, the weight of 500 eyes on us. Then Jason stepped forward. He moved calm, not rushed, as if he'd been expecting this. His hand shot out, gripping my father's wrist in an iron hold. Not violent, not reckless, just firm, unyielding. He leaned in close, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You didn't just insult my fiancé, you mocked every man and woman who bled for this country." His words landed harder than the slap. The shift was immediate. The entire right side of the chapel uniforms of every kind rose to their feet in unison. Salutes snapped into place, crisp and deliberate. Even some civilians, awkward but sincere, followed their lead. The business side faltered, unsure, caught between loyalty to money and the undeniable truth of sacrifice. My father's face drained of color. He looked small, cornered, like a man who realized too late that his power didn't apply here. Victoria tried to stand, tried to smooth it over with a forced laugh, but no one listened. The authority had shifted, and everyone knew it. My father, who'd built his empire on commanding rooms, had lost control in front of 500 people. Jason released his wrists slowly, like setting down something fragile or broken. My father stumbled back a step, clutching his arm, his eyes darting as the silence turned into collective judgment. I stood taller, the sting on my cheek burning less than the pride rising in my chest. My medals weren't silly. They weren't decorations. They were proof of deserts crossed, lives saved, sacrifices made, proof of every night I'd carried weight my family never acknowledged. And in that moment, the proof mattered more than any empire of glass and steel. From the front row, Torres' prosthetic leg tapping the floor broke the silence with 3 words. "Commander on deck." The response was instant. Every service member in the room snapped to attention, saluting with precision that shook the air. The civilians followed with silence, the kind that carried respect instead of pity. My father's empire had bought him power, but it had never earned him this. Respect, loyalty, truth. Standing in that aisle, cheek still red, I realized I didn't need his approval. I never had. What I had built couldn't be bought or mocked away. The chaplain, voice unsteady at first, finally cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" The room stayed on its feet, the tension still thick, but Jason's hand brushed mine lightly. I nodded once. Yes, we would continue. Because nothing my father did could stop it now. The chapel didn't return to normal after that slap. It couldn't. My father had exposed himself in front of everyone, and Jason's words had stripped away the last layer of his control. 500 people had witnessed it, and 500 people had already decided where their respect belonged. The chaplain's voice steadied as he moved through the vows. Jason's hands were firm in mine, his eyes locked on me as though nothing else in the world existed. When he said, "I do," it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was calm, certain, unshakable. When it was my turn, I didn't waver. The sting on my cheek was still there, but my voice carried strong. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was raw, grounded in what everyone had just seen. At the reception, the air was thick with whispers. Guests replayed the moment in hushed tones. The command, the refusal, the slap, the words, the salutes. No one laughed. No one brushed it off. My father left early, slipping out a side door before the cake was even cut. No grand speech, no dramatic exit, just a man retreating into the shadows of his own disgrace. Victoria stayed longer, but the shine was gone. Her smiles were brittle, her small talk forced. Even her usual circle of admirers kept glancing toward me and Jason, their eyes carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. Jason and I barely noticed. We made our rounds, thanked friends, shared quiet moments with the people who mattered. The SEALs stood in the back like sentinels, relaxed but watchful, their presence louder than any toast. Torres clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You walked taller than anyone in that room." Hill simply nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That was all I needed. By the time the night wound down, the story had already left the walls of the venue. Phones buzzed, articles drafted, whispers spreading through both business and military circles. Gregory Mitchell, titan of real estate, had tried to humiliate his daughter at her own wedding and lost. The man who built his empire on commanding attention had been stripped of it in seconds. His reputation, so carefully polished over decades, now carried a crack no amount of money could fix. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Revenge had never been about breaking him. It was about standing so tall that he could no longer look down on me. And that had happened. Right there, with 500 witnesses. Later that night, Jason and I stepped outside for air. The city was quiet, the moon reflecting off the harbor. He touched my cheek gently, thumb brushing the faint red mark. "Does it hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." He smiled. "Good, because what people will remember isn't the slap, it's how you stood." He was right. People would forget the sting of that moment, but they wouldn't forget the sight of a daughter refusing to bow, of a commander standing taller than her father's empire. That was the kind of memory that didn't fade. In the days that followed, the fallout hit fast. Dad retreated from the public eye, stepping back from the company he'd once controlled with an iron grip. Victoria's standing in Boston's social circles wavered. The whispers at galas weren't about her latest deal, but about how she'd sat in silence while her sister was struck. For people obsessed with appearances, silence was as damning as action. As for me, I didn't need to say a word. Articles spoke for themselves. Photos of Jason's grip on my father's wrist circulated everywhere, paired with headlines about loyalty, respect, and the weight of service. For the first time, the public narrative wasn't about Mitchell Realty, it was about the daughter they'd dismissed. The officer, the woman who stood her ground. But the real victory wasn't in the papers or the whispers. It was in the understanding that I no longer needed their approval. Not my father's, not Victoria's, not anyone's. I had my own life, my own family, my own respect. It had been earned through sacrifice, loyalty, and truth. And no empire of glass and steel could compete with that. That night, as Jason and I finally sat down, exhausted, but content, I thought about Mom. I could still hear her voice. Keep choosing what's true. I had. And it had led me here, to a marriage built on respect, to a life built on service, to a moment where the balance of power shifted without a single blow struck. Revenge hadn't required violence. It had required standing firm in who I was until the world had no choice but to see it. Respect isn't bought with money or titles. It's earned. Through sacrifice, through loyalty, through truth. And that, more than anything, was the legacy I carried forward. Looking back, I don't think of that day as a wedding ruined by a slap. I think of it as the day the truth finally stood taller than money, louder than titles, and stronger than control. My father walked away smaller. My sister lost her shine, but I didn't need to win against them. I only needed to stand as myself, in uniform, with the people who mattered. That was the real victory.